Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from the Berlin-based Think and Do tank Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy and security. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayer.
And I'm Alexandra Steinkraus. In this series, you will hear from experts and practitioners offering their take on climate foreign policy, climate-related impacts to security, and promoting peace and resilience in the changing climate. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow @ClimateDiplo on Twitter.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode as we look into the interaction between climate, peace, and security matters and environmental crime. We are joined today by Fabian Keske, who is a researcher at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. He focuses on environmental crimes and climate, peace, and security. And he will help shed some light into the dynamics through which the changing climate interacts with environmental crimes, as well as some of the trends and geopolitics behind it, and what solutions are on the table to tackle both. Welcome to our podcast, Fabian.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Welcome. Really glad to have you on this month's episode. And to start us off, a relatively broad, straightforward question, but what is environmental crime? And I think often, especially for our audience members, they're thinking of environmental crime, especially in the context of ongoing war. So examples from the Gulf War as well as Ukraine often pop up. But if you could also provide some examples at the global scale, that would be great.
Yes, so environmental crime, or how we say in the United Nations lingua, crimes that affect the environment, a term that has been coined a bit in the past years by United Nations resolutions by several different bodies, such as the General Assembly, but also the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. So crimes that affect the environment, I would say they have two main dimensions. The one is that it includes activities that have a very negative impact on the environment. And secondly, it concerns all those activities that are then additionally as well criminalized in the national law of the states. Criminalization actually refers to then those activities that are specifically harmful to the environment and that are sanctioned, for instance, with a criminal sanction, which can be imprisonment, which can be a very heavy monetary fine, for instance. So typically there is a judicial process that offenders have to undergo in order for them to be sentenced. And this constitutes then an environmental crime or crimes that affect the environment. In general, some examples that you ask for, because there are a myriad of criminal activities that can actually be counted as crimes that affect the environment. We have different cases of illegal pollution, for instance, and that can raise from water pollution, but also to hazardous waste, probably, as well to soil pollution. Concerning pollution, maybe one of the most known cases is the Deepwater Horizon spill in 2010, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico. And there are instances of illegal wildlife trade, so trade and trafficking in species that are protected, for instance, by law, such as rhinos, but also turtles, spiders, parrots. So the list is very long. Plants also fall under this category. And then we have illegal deforestation, which is a criminal activity that is very often also related to ongoing conflicts, for instance, in Brazil or in general in Latin America. Also, for instance, when looking at Colombia, where we can see that a lot of the land that is actually deforested for drug production is land that is owned by indigenous people or that is specifically protected for environmental purposes. And of course, the list is very long. Illegal fishing, for instance, can be part of it, and various other aspects as well.
Thanks very much for setting the scene. I do want to get into why different actors may commit environmental crimes, because you mentioned criminalization, different legality things, and oftentimes this is easier said than done. But when talking about a crime as something with, how did you refer to it as?
Crimes that affect the environment.
Yeah, crimes that affect the environment and something with a judicial approach. Is it easy to actually take action on these kinds of crimes?
Well, that depends very much on the crime itself. And I'm sure we'll dive a bit into this. All the different crimes that affect the environment are different types of offenders, different actors who are involved in these crimes. Then they make use of different methods or different strategies that enable, facilitate, or sustain these criminal activities. They have different motivations, which also means then for tackling these crimes, there are many different ways how this criminal activity might be approached. For a small-scale farmer, there might might be a different solution than for a big transnational company, for instance, that might have conducted a criminal activity. The same goes for an armed group where a different strategy might actually lead to a reduction in crimes that affect the environment.
So speaking of different reasons and different purposes where an environmental crime may occur, one of the things that are often talked about, especially in the climate peace security space, is situations with lacking or unstable livelihoods. And in the larger scheme of things, when it comes to crimes against the environment, how big of a threat are these often seen as a cause for environmental crimes?
Yeah, in general, it's very difficult to say how big the threat actually is and to quantify it. That has different reasons. As I work as a researcher, I can shed a brief light actually on why it's so difficult to measure these crimes and then also to measure the impact as well and to see what the relation to conflict then is. So in general, there are no homogeneous definitions across different legal systems. So in every country, a different activity that negatively affects the environment might be criminalized. We see these activities happening in remote areas where they are often not detected. The environment in itself cannot file a complaint with the police, for instance, about a harmful activity, but you need a person that is actually doing this. So many crimes might also go undetected. And then with regards to what motivations people have to commit crimes that affect the environment or to engage in these illegal activities, there are a myriad of causes. When we look especially at the individual level, why individuals that are particularly probably threatened as well in their livelihood already conduct crimes that affect the environment, I think we can broadly differentiate between three different groups of motivations, so to say. One might be information driven. So there might be just a lack of awareness about the regulation, actually. There might also be a lack of awareness about the fact that the environment should be protected. The second one could be then related to perceptions and beliefs. So even when there is an awareness about the law itself, there might, however, be the perception that this regulation or this law is not a legitimate law and might be disrespected because of this. And then, of course, there are more interest-based motivations, interests coming from all different kinds of areas, be it potential benefits to the social status that offenders hope for, which relate to income, which can relate to different things, safety, for instance, protection, or just because the offender or his or her community that is affected might just have urgent needs for food, for instance. So all this comes together and then shapes probably the motivation. And it's very difficult to differentiate between these different motivations. But of course, already it shows a bit that there are many points where one could enter to influence motivations and reduce probably also crimes that affect the environment.
Absolutely. And if we're thinking of the driver that is the financial incentives, right? Like the benefit that you will get, the financial benefits of committing a crime that impacts nature. Because we can say it's a generalization, but I guess we can say that environmental crimes are often very profitable, so that there's a whole landscape of actors who are engaging not just accidentally or not just by need, but perhaps also systematically in this type of crime, including armed and criminal groups. So thinking from this perspective of financial incentives, how often would you say this is the case? How big is this in the whole scheme of things and around environmental crimes? And also, what are perhaps some of the latest trends that you've been seeing in your work?
Yeah, also for this one, of course, it's very difficult to have estimations that are robust and reliable. Several international organizations estimate for different crimes that affect the environment, for instance, illegal fishing, but also illegal deforestation or different other activities, to be accumulated at least in the billions, so to say. So we're talking about quite a lot of harm that is inflicted upon the environment, but then also quite a lot of profit that can be accumulated through such a criminal activity. And I would like to differentiate here between two different actors where we can really see some of the dynamics, but also which role finances play and what other motivations might as well play a role here. One of them being organized crime groups, organized criminal groups, which are typically profit-driven actors. They exploit weaknesses in the value or supply chains of various goods, for instance, of gold or of fish, of timber that is exported throughout the world, where we have a demand that is created that stems from international trading markets, for instance, in Asia, Europe, or also Northern America for these different goods. However, what these organized criminal groups very often do not have, what we see, however, with regards to more armed groups that are involved in crimes that affect the environment, is actually probably an element of political ambition, maybe as well an element that can go hand in hand with it of territorial control, so to say. So one example I can give is about armed groups that are involved in gold smuggling or gold mining and gold smuggling in the Sahel region. And there we see that finances play a role. So armed groups are creating actually income by controlling mines, by controlling the transport routes also that lead to mines or where gold or other minerals might be smuggled away to international markets over various traffickers, middlemen, and different actors that are involved there. And this then also directly drives down the revenue of the state, for instance, also through taxation. So we see a positive income for the armed group, but also a negative one for the state. However, what we also found during our research actually in the Sahel on artisanal and small-scale gold mining is that there are different motivations here as well. For instance, recruitment opportunities for armed groups along these mines, for instance, when they use a rhetoric of defending communities against profiteering foreigners, for instance, so they can really use this as an opportunity to rally support. And this activity then helps in actually recruitment of probably new fighters as well for armed conflicts. And also another advantage can be easy access to fuel, for instance, or explosives, all things that are, for instance, used in mining operations as well. So definitely what we can see here is because we have a conflict economy that might develop around such an illegal activity, in this case, illegal mining, for instance, this can be a barrier to peace because it also undermines the capacity of the state and then can foster indirectly or directly fragility within communities.
Have you seen through your work any kind of environmental crime or perhaps ways in which these crimes are committed emerging as more or less attractive in these latest emerging trends? Or because even from the view of a changing climate, I mean, the availability and the ways to access resources are changing. So perhaps this also has an influence on environmental crimes?
Yes, definitely. There are a few trends which I can shine some light on. What we see in general is that opportunity very often creates crime. And through accelerated, globalized processes, there are more opportunities that can or could now be exploited. Doesn't mean they are, but there's a playing field that is emerging here. Generally, what we see is that patterns of consumption change, and so do as well the crimes that affect the environment that are also committed. So we see, for instance, a more demand for critical minerals at the moment. For instance, cobalt, lithium, rare earth minerals, which are mined all over the world. However, some of these mining operations might also be then prone to be exploited also illegally, where environmental regulations or other regulations that govern the extraction processes, also with regards to protection of labor, are disregarded. Another trend that we see, for instance, the poaching of elephants and rhinos, for instance, has been going down in the past years. At least different kinds of sources have shown this. The market price has been going, conservation numbers have been stable, but also there have been lower poaching numbers. And this was at least in a trend noted until 2022. So there are some positive numbers. However, what we see is that digital platforms are increasingly used as it's way easier to find buyers or to find traders for certain goods that might be illegally exploited, such as wildlife, such as fish, or may even be waste that is trafficked across borders. And online transactions can just be conducted in a very swift way, in a very anonymous way as well. And then we have some evergreens, I would say, which might have always been there and they don't emerge new. But still, I would like to mention one of them, which is just the laundering of goods into the value chain, which we see on several occasions, which basically means that we have also not only organized groups which conduct all of their activities probably illegally, but we have also companies or corporations that have a legitimate business, and some of the activities that are conducted by them, some of the fish that is caught, as well as some of the minerals that are mined for, some of the forest that is deforested to sell the timber. And some of this is then legitimized into the value chain by being mixed with goods that were legally sourced. And so in the end, there's no individual black market for these crimes that affect the environment, but rather one market that exists already and where these goods end up in.
So a bit shifting gears now, looking at these different stakeholders, different group dynamics, and one thing central to most climate peace security analyses or approaches is an intersectional lens and looking at these different issues and how they impact different social groups differently with marginalized or people living in fragile context. So, for example, ethnic and indigenous groups or women and elderly, and looking how are they suffering differently? Are they suffering increased impacts? So, are these dynamics similar to the ones you're looking at in the context of environmental crimes? And are these different social groups more prone to engaging in these types of activities or more prone to suffer from their impacts? Or is it both in some of these cases?
Yeah, that's a very complex question. I think we see it is that crimes that affect the environment are an integral part of as well the broader sphere and field of climate peace and security. In the end, there are many activities that contribute to environmental degradation. Many of those activities are actually legal, and some of them are illegal, those that we talk about today here. And so they contribute to environmental change, to environmental degradation through various means, the destruction, for instance, of ecosystems that have critical functions for the world or for the communities that live close by. They provide food, they provide income, they have cultural values. So we see this environmental change to which crimes that affect the environment contribute. For instance, when a forest is cut, it cannot no longer provide the basis of food and income. So for the livelihoods as well of the people that live from it. And this could very well then increase fragility and conflict risks, so to say, just by exposing people more to certain vulnerabilities that exists and just decrease the access or availability of natural resources, can then further lead in the most severe cases to displacement or migration. And of course, there are public health risks that are associated with it. For instance, when a river is polluted and people need to drink from this river, this might very well destroy their basis to drink, to have an access to safe and healthy drinking water, might lead to diseases that spread. So there are different aspects here that play a huge role. And of course, this can then also weaken the capacity of the state to respond to these different activities when the state as well has not the capacity anymore, or it was already under stress before, to provide for its population, for different communities, especially those that are already marginalized, especially those that might live in remote areas where there's also a high endowment to natural resources. Then all these risks are elevated and can play out in a way where marginalized and already affected people are even more disproportionately affected. So I would say that crimes that affect the environment are one element within the broader climate peace and security debate. And the dynamics can be similar, but of course they can also be very different. So of course it depends very much on the activity, what the impact then is, and how much the people affected, they suffer from this. Elderly people, children, women are typically groups of people where we see higher risks of being more affected by these crimes that affect the environment, and of course by the larger impact that this has around the general trend of climate change, the loss of biodiversity, and as well pollution that not only stem from illegal activities. What is interesting is that already in 2014, for instance, the United Nations Security Council recognized the linkage between the illegal exploitation then of natural resources and then ultimately as well the conflicts in the region of the Great Lakes in Africa. This was specifically to trafficking in wildlife and illicit trade in those resources, but also because what was going hand in hand with it at the time and what the Security Council recognized was that there was a proliferation and trafficking of arms, for instance. And of course, this then has the potential to fuel as well a conflict. What's also, I think, always important is that these conflicts, they are political in the end. So in general, this is not only about human security, but it's also about the perceived legitimacy that people have vis-a-vis public institutions and the state, the trust they have into the state institutions, and how far the state might be able to solve as well these problems that the people have. And when this capacity is already weakened and this will continue, it's already under stress, then of course it might cross a tipping point at some point.
Thank you, Fabian. And speaking of perceptions, we know that climate peace and security issues, they're currently very prominent in the international space. They are coming up quite a lot in global fora and speeches and political agendas, definitely in this podcast. And we're even seeing, I guess it's fair to say, we're seeing an institutionalization of climate peace and security in the sense that the recognition of these interactions is at the moment so far reaching that institutions are starting to embed these considerations and these interactions as well into their own programs, also to avoid doing harm and pushing this interaction even further. And then on the other hand, we have the topic of environmental crimes, which is not new. It has been away for quite a while, being sometimes more at the center or less at the center of discussions. So my question to you is, in your opinion, do you think that this growing attention that climate peace and security issues are receiving at the moment in the international stage, do you think that they have brought more attention to international crimes? And if you think that they did, do you think that this had caused any impacts in combating or mitigating this type of crime?
Yes, I would agree that there has been greater attention to crimes, the environment, and in general to activities that are illegal and have a negative impact on the environment. I think we can see this on various policy initiatives, for instance, that have been launched since a year in all different kinds of institutions. For instance, recent pushes to codify and put into law ecocide that has been conducted by various countries. We see that the International Criminal Court, for instance, is working on a policy to prosecute environmental crimes under the Rome Statute. Or, for instance, I think that started in 2021, the Financial Action Task Force also set a new emphasis on detecting and also combating crimes that affect the environment with regards to the financial dimension of it in order to drain the profits and ensure that the assets of these crimes are probably recovered. And of course, then that a legitimate restitutive justice process can also be conducted. What the impact of these activities is a very big question. Again, in general, there has been, however, a lot of focus on the potential that the criminal justice system has with regards to addressing the broader issues of climate peace and security, and to really highlight this role that the criminal justice system can play, which it relates to law enforcement, enforcing laws better. It relates also in a more effective way to having a legislative framework that does not leave any gaps for potential offenders to be exploited and to conduct harmful activities that are totally legal. And this also relates to prosecution. We have seen an increase in court cases that deal with crimes that affect the environment. And all this also plays a role then for crime prevention, which is then ultimately the critical dimension to move into, because the harm inflicted upon the environment is something that cannot easily be remedied or that can easily be restored. Very often these are processes that take a lot of time. They are very cost intensive as well. And so ultimately already the attention that has been brought can have a preventive impact as well on all kinds of different actors to strengthen their laws, strengthen the deterrent effect of sanctions, for instance, where appropriate for the biggest offenders, and ensure that law enforcement authorities also make use of the latest technologies, for instance, and work better together on the international level to ensure that across the value chains that are highly internationalized, that are behind the trafficking, for instance, of gold or the international fish trade, those activities that are really illegal and criminal and are specifically harmful to the environment, that those can be addressed.
So now, looking a bit broader here and at the landscape of different actors, there's no doubt that we're currently seeing a lot of geopolitical shifts and shifts in accepted norms that will without a doubt have impacts at the global level. So while if you're able to speak to any broader implications for the work that you're doing on crimes against the environment, that would be more than welcome. We'd really like to look a bit further into the economic perspective here, or geoeconomic perspective, if you will, and also beyond the role of any specific nation state or collection of different nations, and looking a bit at the role of corporations in environmental crime. So could you shed a little bit of light onto what the role of these corporations play?
There are many corporations that conduct completely legal and legitimate businesses without conducting ever criminal activities or even illegal activities then. However, what we also see is that some corporations who work in these very internationalized supply chains or value chains catch a share of the fish illegally. Some of the gold that is mined through activities that are very harmful to the environment, for instance, through the use of mercury, or that even forced labor is used in the extraction processes. And this is something that definitely plays a big role, especially where we have commodities that are traded, but they are traded on one illegal market. In general, this really means that we have a high interconnectedness of different value chains, which really go hand in hand. What we also see is that these businesses also have quite sophisticated methods or strategies to conceal or to enable, sustain, and facilitate the illegal activities. For instance, already through document frauds that are committed in the early stages of the value chain. For instance, when they apply for a license for a mining operation. On the other side, we also see legitimate business organizations that do not have any licenses for a mine. And this then continues and trickles down the entire value chain. When one document fraud is committed, very often the information in the document are passed on to other documents and to other authorities. And so the infiltration of the value chain very often starts already in the early stages, which also means that there's a great potential actually to strengthen the preventive action this early on in the value chain. What it also means is that corporate accountability plays an increasing role. In many criminal codes or in many also environmental laws in different states, there's a differentiation between the liability for natural persons very often, which are just normal human beings, and then legal persons, which typically refers to legal constructs, businesses, corporations, companies, all different kinds of economic actors and that have them in themselves a legal personality. And a recent study conducted by UNODC actually shows that there's still a lot of space to strengthen the corporate liability. For instance, around illegal fishing or illegal logging, there are around 20 member states, if I remember correctly, that actually have particularly mentioned corporate liability. So only this mention in the law allows actually then a formal process against the company itself, and not against the individual that might be just a small worker in the company, for instance, working in a mine, but really against the people taking the decisions. So this plays a role to ensure that the most common and probably also most serious defenders within companies are actually subjected to some of the law, because what we see at the moment is they are rather subject to lower levels of punishment, which also has no deterrent effect in order to prevent these activities from actually happening in the first place.
Well, there's so much to unpack on each of these many points you have raised. So to make it easier for us to follow, let's zoom into one case. This year we have Brazil hosting COP30, as we know. But what many might not know is that Brazil is also holding the chairmanship of the BRICS group this year. Not to mention that it had just recently concluded a presidency term of the G20. So there's quite a lot going on in Brazil right now in the international space and also in the region itself. For example, we have Colombia that is increasingly looking at how climate and environment interact with their internal conflicts as well as they did, as even in the context of the biodiversity COP. So quite a lot going on in the region and quite a lot of attention from the international stage to this region currently. And Brazil is definitely a country that comes to mind, right? If we're speaking about environmental crimes, it's very often at the forefront of this type of crime involving the environment and natural resources. And maybe you can shine a spotlight on where Brazil is at today in terms of environmental crime, perhaps also if there's some ways that you can think of that the country can use its role, quite central role at the moment, in all of these international fora to address the issue.
Yeah, Brazil has received a lot of attention in the past years with regards especially to the protection of the Amazon rainforest, which is still the world's largest tropical rainforest, accounting for 40%, I think, of the world's remaining rainforest. However, according to the United Nations Environment Programme, around 20% of its original area has been lost, which means that this ecosystem, which is of international relevance and importance to preserve, is under threat. And I would like to give a concrete example actually on one study that UNODC conducted in northern Brazil in one of the estuaries of the Amazon, the Tapajós River, where there have been actually quite a lot of illegal mining operations ongoing, especially with regards to mining without licenses. And there has been, especially between 2018 and 2022, for instance, an increase of a few 100% of these offenses. what is interesting is that this relates very much to further crimes as well that then co-occur in these dynamics of these mining operations. So we see human rights violations that occur, especially in the settlements of the miners with relation to trafficking persons, sexual exploitation, forced labor, but also lethal violence. And generally the highways, for instance, that have been also used to transport probably timber and also minerals then are also used for drug trafficking. So we see a whole complex of different crimes that take place, with some of them being closely related to crimes that affect the environment. So Brazil has a very prominent role, as you mentioned, in the international fora, which is quite remarkable, which is really also creating another window of opportunity to develop more effective solutions against crimes that affect the environment. What all these initiatives have in common is that they are on the international level. And what we see is that value chains, especially of timber, but also of mining, they are very international. So the demand stems from another continent, and then the license might be applied by a transnational corporate construct that has its business seat in another state. And then the mining operation finally is conducted, for instance, in Brazil. So we see a market-driven exploitation of these, which also means that through international cooperation, through increasing the traceability of some of the goods that are trafficked, for instance, not only can sustainability of these products and goods be improved, but also, of course, the human security impact can finally be mitigated. And by conducting really targeted, I think, international cooperation, as we've seen under various of these initiatives, there's a lot of potential to increase the cooperation on a more operative level and to have use the political momentum to really ensure that different law enforcement agencies from different countries, but also from different sectors, for instance, those working on the environment, but also those working on economic and financial crimes, such as tax fraud or money laundering, that those work better together. They detect illicit financial flows, for instance, and they can ensure that the profit that is generated through crimes that affect the environment runs out.
Thanks very much. And before we close out today, we'll end it on a bit of an open note, but I think this conversation has been really helpful, especially in understanding the landscape of different actors who are both committing crimes as well as the different impacts that are being faced by different communities, different groups of actors, as well as some of the challenges that come with holding these stakeholders, actors accountable. But within the next decade, if we can look at this larger time span, what do you think the biggest challenges for those working to mitigate environmental crimes will be? And do you see any silver linings or signs of hope on the horizon?
Yes, I think in general, one of the main challenges remains the complexity of the whole topic and how it relates to various different fields that we see, and that all come together and play a role in climate peace and security, finally. All of these issues are interconnected. However, they are also very individualized in itself. Each criminal activity might have a different modus operandi. So, for instance, how these crimes are conducted, where it's worth engaging also with the public sector to ensure that criminal activities run smoothly by bribing state officials. And the places where these crimes conducted are, again, very different. The trading routes might be different. They make use of the infrastructure that exists already. For instance, export markets, ports, where goods from all over the world are landed. They need to be correctly labeled in order to make sure that no illegal activities occur with regards to them. However, these are all things that remain a challenge. We see that crimes that affect the environment take place in an environment themselves, which is a globalized world. And this definitely is one of the key challenges. So to continue detecting crimes that affect the environment by just increasing access to justice, but also monitoring of critically important ecosystems and environments is equally important, as is addressing the root causes of criminality. And these depend very much on the actors themselves involved. So, of course, an individual that is committing such a crime because of food insecurity or income security, this situation requires a different solution in the end than the activities conducted by a corporation. And so developing really targeted solutions for different types of crimes that affect the environment in different contexts, this will for sure remain one of the challenges. However, I think much progress has been made in the past years. And one of the major ones probably being that the criminal justice system discovered its role and the role it has to play with regards to strengthening environmental protection in general through adjudication, through prevention, through law enforcement as well, and really made use of the teeth a state can also have to ensure that these crimes do not occur only where it's appropriate. And so really leveraging the criminal justice system plays a role in the future. It's only one of the tools at hand. And there are many others when we talk about development, when we talk about stabilization, peace building, and criminal justice system can play a role in this, and it will continue to play a role. So to finish on a happy note, as I find it important to celebrate the small wins, for instance, just in December last year, there have been detection of over 1,000 lemurs and tortoises in Thailand, which have been then brought back to Madagascar together in a concerted effort by law enforcement authorities and international organizations. So yeah, activities like that, where you can also see the progress that has been made, are always important to remember. Also, there's a lot of progress that has been made and that will be continued to be made.
Thank you. We love finishing on a happy note here at the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. So thank you for that. It's also good to know that some actions are bringing results so that we feel also motivated to keep looking also for the issues that are still growing at the moment. So thanks so much for that. Thanks so much, Fabian, for joining us and for explaining this super complex topic to us.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thanks for still doing this podcast.
In this episode, we've explored the intricate relationship between climate, peace, security, and environmental crime with Fabian Keske from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Fabian explained that for the UN system, environmental crime is defined as activities that negatively impact the environment and are criminalized by national laws. Examples include illegal pollution, wildlife trade, deforestation, and fishing. These are crimes that often occur in remote areas and make detection and prosecution very challenging, and the motivations behind them range from financial incentives, with organized crime groups and armed factions exploiting these opportunities for profit and territorial control, to survival needs from those who have lost their livelihoods. The discussion highlights the complexity of addressing environmental crimes due to varying legal definitions, remote crime locations, and diverse motivations. Keske notes that financial incentives drive many environmental crimes, with international markets creating demand for illegally sourced goods like timber and minerals. The episode also touches on the role of corporations in environmental crime, emphasizing the need for corporate accountability and legal frameworks to prosecute such offenses effectively. Brazil, which is currently prominent in the international stage, serves as a case study for environmental crime, particularly regarding illegal mining and deforestation, especially in the Amazon region. Brazil's international role, such as hosting COP30 in 2025, could be leveraged to address environmental crime through enhanced international cooperation and issues such as the traceability of goods. We conclude the episode with a reflection on the challenges ahead and the need for targeted solutions. This was the Climate Diplomacy Podcast. We will be back with another episode in a few weeks. Until next time, goodbye.